how you maintain backup servers in case of a failure. Discussed.
Hello, sir. Sir.
Yes.
Hello. Hello. Sound එක පැහැදිලි මදි සර් කියන සමහර වචන හෙන්නේ
නැහැ. Can you now it's still not clear. Right, check whether you can hear me now. We discussed about rack-only architecture and other ways of acting into disaster situations. So, do you have any questions regarding what we discussed last week? We discussed about data guard. We moved to what is called two ways of dealing with the potential for disasters. In disaster situation, we can handle it in two ways. The first way is to plan it well and handle it before we face to a disaster situation. That is what we call we take precautions. If we do not do anything, then we just keep quiet, then we cannot expect what to happen, right? So if we have not properly planned for disastrous situations, we can find unplanned downtimes. Unplanned downtime there can be many reasons for unplanned downtimes. So it can be software failures, hardware failures, human errors, or disasters. There can be natural disasters or any other disaster situation like bombing. Software failures, I think you know, your operating system would not start properly, your database might have corrupted or something like that, middleware problems, application software problems, or even network problems. Right? Now let's assume your network connection is not available even for several hours or even for several days or weeks. Then your database may not be able to connect and work as expected. Therefore, you would lose your money as a business. Then it may arise many other associated problems. Then you may get hardware failures like CPU problems, memory, power supply. Likewise, all the hardware components can malfunction or avoid working as expected. Then after you may find human errors, like you have not properly done your administration part. It's a duty of system administrator and DBA administrator as well. Also, user may not have properly inserted required data. Therefore, it may introduce human errors. So if you have not planned for that, then any one of these can cause unplanned downtimes. That is, the system is not able to up and run. But if you have properly planned, so we call it a planned downtime, you can let the system down as you plan, and you can continue the business because you know when to plan your downtime and what to do with each downtime, so you can make the precautions to avoid disastrous situation. If you take planned downtimes, you might have routine operations like backups, performance management, security management, and batches. So likewise, if you take periodic maintenance, so you have to do it repeatedly as you have planned. So you can do storage maintenance, initialization of parameters. You can have software patches and schema management, operating systems, middleware, and network. Right? You can do required alterations and required changes to the system before it fails. Right? It's a kind of maintenance. The other thing is new deployments can also take place as planned. With that, you can have hardware upgrades, operating system upgrades, database upgrades, middleware upgrades, also your applications as well as network upgrades. Right? Both applications as well as network can be upgraded before you run into trouble. These are called planned updates, planned downtimes, because we let the system to be down, but it's okay according to our plan. Right? We know we are going to down the system according to the plan. If we have not done any of the maintenance things and planned downtime, it would result in unplanned downtime. Right? I hope you can understand that. With that, we go to the next section, that is database administration. So the main duty of database administration is to manage and maintain a Dbms software. So normally in leading database management systems like Oracle, IBM DB2, Microsoft SQL Server needs specialized people to run the role of a database administrator. I think you are familiar with the word database administrator, because he has to take care of a lot of things in a database. We would quickly look at the responsibilities of a DBA, and this is also very important for you when you seek for jobs. Even this type of responsibilities has to be catered by you. Then you can adjust accordingly if you are planning to seek a job of a database administrator. If you check the first responsibility, he has to install, configure and upgrade database server, software and related products. I think I told you in my previous lesson, not just the database is sufficient. If you take the previous slides, we discussed about this only architecture as well as data guards. Those are some other tools given by Oracle. So they are also apart from the database management system. Therefore, the DBA has to install related software and maintain them in updated manner. Anyhow, it's very costly depending on the organization. The different softwares might be used to do the other related operations. Then DB has to evaluate database features and database related products. Also, he has to maintain backups and recovery policies and procedures. These backup and recovery policies comes under disaster recovery plan as well as business continuity plan. Otherwise, if you have not properly made the backup, then you will not be able to reinstall your database at a disaster situation. DBA should also have to take care of the database design and implementation, and he has to maintain the database security. So in the security, you can create different levels of access depending on the access levels. Different users given different privileges to access the database. Then after, you can do database tuning and performance monitoring as a DBA. Also application tuning and performance monitoring. Those can be most probably done by the tools, but those tools are comparatively expensive when compared to the database management system. Then the DBA can set up and maintain documentation and standards. That is also very important, because he has to come up with the way of implementing and managing the database. So then in that case, he can come up with maintenance schedules as well as relevant documents, and he has to follow the standards. Then if you go for backup and recovery options, then you have to definitely DBA has to plan the growth and changes. So if you just take as an example, if a particular telecommunication provider may have 5 GB of database at the beginning. At first quarter of the year, they may introduce different promotions. Due to that, their capacity can be doubled due to the increase of customer base, right? Likewise, depending on the time durations, your database capacity would be increasing. Now, if you just want to make a backup of that particular database, then you should definitely have another place or another disk having the same amount of capacity just to backup, right? If you just take the exact backup, then you need that amount of space in another server or whatever place. But that is not normally sufficient. We normally plan for 3 times of the main server or production server's capacity has to be maintained in the backup servers, right? Otherwise, when we actually face to a particular scenario or disaster situation, our backup server is not in a position to handle that. That is again another disaster, right? So we are planning to recover from a disaster, but it introduces another disaster because there's no way of backing up the existing database due to lack of space in the backup server. Then, as a DBA, it's a 24/7 kind of job. Therefore, the DBA has to work as a part of a team and support them when they found problems and keep the database up and running. And the other thing, do general technical troubleshooting and give his contributions. Then after, he has to do the database recovery whenever needed. Right? Those are main points of a database administrator. You will find database administrators in your future when you join and work in certain organizations. If you check database administrators, those database administrators can be categorized into 3 major types. The first one is system Dbas. They are normally focused on physical aspects of the database administration. For example, database installation, configuration, patching, upgrades, backups, restore, and so on. Okay. But if you check development Dbas, they mainly focus on logical and development aspects of database administration. As an example, the data model design, maintenance, data definition language generation, SQL writing and tuning, and so on. Therefore, they have to collaborate with developers to help and choose the most appropriate Dbms features. If you take one example, development Dbas would suggest different ways of techniques and ways of making backups and doing analysis over the databases and things like that. The third type is the application Dbas. So this type of database administrators can be found in organizations that have purchased third-party application softwares like enterprise resource planning, customer relationship management systems, right? So we have to deal with such applications if we are application database administrator, right? I think you would find this type of database administrator, and when you are planning to join for a industrial training, you can seek for a reputed place, then you would be able to observe this type of database administrators. In some companies, they are hiring just a database administrator, but he has to take care of all these three things, right? Most probably, if the company is not that much large, then they normally hire a single person who is taking the duty of all three types of database administrators. Okay, do you have any questions up to now? Right, if you do not have any questions, you can quickly try this exercise. So we are now going to talk about database backups. And before that, to understand the importance of backup, you can do this exercise, and it would give you a better understanding and motivation to discuss about the database backups and recovery. It is also has to be it has to be thoroughly taken care of. Otherwise, in the side of database, you might feel database is fully SQL and other query related relationality and so on, right? But if you really implement a database, it has many things beyond SQL and relational algebra, as well as querying a database, right? Okay, right. You just quickly take this into your notes and try to answer. That is not that much hard. Therefore, you can quickly finish this off, and we can discuss and start the database backup and recovery. Actually, there can be many importance. So you have to understand why we need backups, right? Especially when you do your final year projects in semester 6, you should also have kind of a knowledge on making backups, right? In software development, we use many type of backups using version control systems. Apart from that, your work has to be backed up, otherwise you would not be able to recover in a disaster situation, right? So what is the different ways that otherwise different tactics you use to make backups? If you take one example, let's say you have 1 terabyte of data to be backed up, right? Now you today buy a new backup device and you copy all the 1 terabyte of data into that particular backup device, right? But let's say by weekend you have another several megabytes, additional megabytes of data. Are you going to totally back up all the 1 terabyte plus let's say 10 MB or 10 MB of data? Are you going to totally create the new backup out of total capacity? Now if you take the 1 terabyte of backup to be copied to your drive, let's say you get 10 to 15 minutes, then you have to waste all 15 minutes all the time you make the complete backup, right? To overcome that, we have other backup techniques. Do you have any idea? Right, there's something called incremental backups. So if you have properly saved your major version, then you can append minor capacities or the minor set of data into that particular main data set. So we call it incremental backup, but we have to have a plan to do the incremental backups. Otherwise, we would not be able to recover all the data in a failure. When you talk about the backup devices, there are many backup devices available, but in your case, what type of devices you used? Give me some examples. If you take devices like pen drives are not actually devices intended to use for backups, right? Normally we call them as data travelers. Data travelers are to take a copy of your data and you when you travel you make the copy in elsewhere, right? We normally do not keep the backups in pen drives. Why we do not do it is you can lose your pen drive very easily, you can damage it, right? So therefore that devices are not built for the purpose of keeping backup, but external hard drive, and there are specially tuned up backup devices with state-of-the-art software even. If you go to Western Digital site or other hardware, hard disk and hardware manufacturers have their different series of backup devices, so you can go and get some idea. Right? But you have to always keep in mind the purpose of that particular device. Right? If it is not designed for that purpose, you should not use it for another purpose if it is not totally suitable to that particular purpose, right? Now let's say you have done all your project work in a pen drive and you suddenly lost your pen drive, or even you can get it damaged, right, by some means. So if it happens, if it is not no longer be used, right, then how can you recover? That is the main problem. If we cannot recover, then there's no point of maintaining a backup there, right? Therefore, we do not recommend to use pen drives, USB sticks and cards, XD cards to keep backups, right? Because normally in your personal and other data only affects for yourself, right? But if you take a database in a banking system, would not affect individually, it affects many of the clients, even the organization, and the issue and the risk is very high. Therefore, we cannot make backups in such devices, and they are comparatively low in performance as well. If you take well optimized devices for maintain backups, right? So there are many tools available to make backups. So you can go to the device manufacturer site and you can get some idea about third-party tools of making backups. With that, we go to the next section. As a DBA, if we feel only the optimal database performance is the most important, but it is not true in related to databases, because if you cannot recover data at a disaster situation, it is very difficult for you to continue the business and maintain the client base even. Therefore, you should have proper mechanisms to recover at any point of failure. We have discussed about the business continuity plan and disaster recovery plan. So I think you have the idea of those two. This backup and recovery is the very important section when we talk about disaster recovery plan and business continuity plan. So as a DBA, you have to prepare for the problem. So you quickly go through the main points I have highlighted here. Those are instance failures, application failures, and media failures. I have pointed out the importance of each failure handling. So you quickly go through and then we can discuss about the major problems. Right, now if you check the instance failures, have you ever found something like this? Now let's say you have a pen drive, you have copied something to the pen drive, but suddenly you have forgotten to remove the pen drive from the operating system. You quickly drag it off and you go to another place. Then you find there's something called scan disk is activated and ask you to scan the device. But in some cases you can recover from the scan disk, but there may be several occasions where you are not be able to recover the files, right? These instance failures can occur instantly without prior notifications, right? Your hardware or memory, whatever, can burn or become malfunction without prior notice. That is why in lectures today, I discussed about unplanned and planned downtimes. If you have planned properly with a maintenance schedule, then you can tackle these type of instance failures, right? So, for an example, if you have properly replaced the hard disk whenever it reaches its lifetime or the warranty period, then you can avoid happening this type of instance failures. But most probably, almost all the organizations, especially if they have not allocated budgets for that type of maintenance, they will be running more than expected lifetime. Right? These instant failures is a common thing. Therefore, you have to pay very much attention on this type of instance failures. Then if you go to application failures, you may run several scripts at the wrong time, right? So you may be running a script to calculate the salary of whatever relevant scripts before the month end, right? So since they have not the fully data is not populated to the database, it would introduce failure results, or it would sometimes result in corrupted data, and your database would be needed to recover. So in theory, if you tackle these application errors sooner, is the better, right? Otherwise, it would repeatedly make damages to the system. Then the other thing is media failure. This media can be the hard disk or file systems, degradation or tape degradation or damages, and you might have deleted files. So anyhow, you have to have proper mechanism to recover when this type of media failure happen. But when you recover a database, it's very important. You have to always recover the actual state, right? For an example, if you take a banking account, before the system failure occurs, you would have certain amount of data, but meanwhile you might have just before the failure or during the failure, you might have doing some transactions, right? Then your balance may not be properly updated, right? Therefore, it would introduce you, not only you, but also the bank, many problems once it is recovered, if it is not properly recovered, right? Let's say you do 100,000 transaction, but it is not properly recovered. Unluckily, you have not even received the money. But in their system, they have updated as you have withdrawn the money, right? So if such a thing happens, then it's a very uncomfortable situation, but we have to take many precautions to avoid such situation. Therefore, it is very important to tackle these type of problems. Right. Now, we have to have a proper backup plan. It's like a insurance plan, because without having a proper backup plan, our database is not properly secured. I think by now you can have some idea about why we need to take care of databases. Right? So it is not just writing SQLs. That is why we are talking about these topics in implementation. Database implementation is not just SQL. Right? So we have to have a sound backup and recovery plan to face for a disastrous situation. So in this case, we have several types of backups. As we discussed in our exercise, we were talking about incremental backups. So here we use something called image copy backups. It's a fundamental component of database backup and recovery plan. So we are creating backup copies of data in a database. Whenever an error is occurred, we have to maintain the integrity of the database, right? I think you know the term called integrity. So we have to have the completeness or soundness of the data in the database, right? All the relationships has to be maintained in the database as it was before the failure, right? Now let's say you have certain accounts in a bank with different account numbers, but you have only one NIC number. Under that, the system should be able to categorize or list down the different types of accounts you have under your NIC number. Now let's say after failing the system is not able to list down your accounts, right? It may list down only few, but some are missing. Then you might have used the integrity of the database, because now the system does not know how to relate accounts under your NIC number. Right? It has become out of integrity of the database. Anyway, this type of image copy backups are very difficult. It's not that much simple. As I told you, if you always have to make the full story backups, then it takes much time, right? To take all things copied and maintained in another place. Anyhow, we need to have this type of image copies to make consistent copies of your data. Normally using in the form of image copies, which are normally out of a copy utility. Normally this copy utility can be found in several database systems. So you can use backup, dump, export like commands in database management systems based upon this type of utilities to make image copies. But some DBMSs, they rely on native operating system file system commands to backing up data. Anyhow, the DBA has to choose the ways of maintaining backup, because he has to have a proper plan of making backups of the system. He's the person who is responsible for the maintaining the database in a proper manner. When you talk about the backups, it's very important to assure the accuracy, because if we cannot assure the accurate image copies, then there's no longer, we can't guarantee it provides the full functioning database once we want to recover. Therefore, DBA must assure the currency or the timely and accuracy of the image copies, and it has to be based on the backup plan and recovery needed for the application. Therefore, the DBA normally use these recovery requirements to determine how often we should take the backups, right? Now let's say you know your database is increasing or growing every week. Therefore, you can take a major backup and you can do increments for weekly wise, right? Whatever the content you found this week, at the end of this week, let's say Saturday night or Friday night, then you can get a small incremental backups end of the each week and append it into the major backup. Therefore, DBA has to have a proper plan and take care of database backups. Further, they can use log records to make recoveries, right? Therefore, it is also very important to recover a database using log files. But there are problems when you want to create recoverable log files. Performance wise also it may sometimes matters, and the other is the capacity to maintain such log files is also high, right? For example, if you take a banking system, they may do millions of transactions for a week, even for a day it's possible, right? Keeping all the transactions in log files is a very big thing, right? Therefore, once a system failure occurred, we have to provide the log files, and we can ask the system to recover from the failure using the log files. Now, if you take the different factors influencing the duration of recovery. Now, let's say this duration of recovery is also very important, right? You can't ask the banking customers to wait weeks or months until you recover a database, right? If something fails, you have to instantly wake up a backup server and connect the load into that particular server. Otherwise, your client definitely withdraw all the money from your bank and they would go for another bank, right? That is a real situation. Therefore, it is very important to recover a database within the minimum time. Anyhow, this time duration is normally affected by different factors. As we already discussed, the log record must be processed and recovered. If you go to that option, it's again one factor which takes more time to recover. The other thing is, if your log files are compacted to save the disk space, then you have to uncompress and read the log files. The other factor is, if your backup is encrypted for the security purpose, then again you need to decrypt the backup and read the content. Other thing is the time taken to mount and dismount the required tapes or disks, right? If you take Unix based systems, you have to mount hard disks, but there is another option called hot swappable hard disks, where you can remove hard disk while the system is keep on running, and you can remove the hard disk and you can fix another one without shutting down or restarting the system. When you have such requirements, you have to buy such devices at a higher cost, right? Then other thing is the time taken to read the part of the log file for the recovery purpose. And the point is time required to process the changed pages of the database. Those factors would influence the duration of recovery. Therefore, having an idea on these factors make you take precautions and make you work in advance as a DBA to minimize the duration of recovery. Apart from that, you may have different other factors as well. The Dbms architecture, if you take Oracle rack architecture, such like thing, they are very high costly solutions, but they are giving better performance than normal database architectures. So you can use such architectures if you are affordable. Anyway, the database architecture also affects the duration of recovery. The other thing is activities during the copy process. It can be read-only or read-write enabled. Right? With that options, it could affect the duration of recovery. The other thing, the balancing duration of the recovery. So against the required time to make image copies, right? Therefore, you should understand how it is important and how it is affected by these factors in database recovery process. Right. As DBA, he has to decide how many complete generations of backups has to be created. Right. The main idea of backup system do recoveries. Therefore, how many backups needed and their time gaps has to be decided by the DBA. If you take extra generations, then it can also help you recover from a media failure during the recovery by switching to an older backup. In theory, at a minimum, the retention period should be at least 2 full cycles, right? And the number of copies you decide to keep has to be tempered by the number of associated logs that must also be maintained for the backups to remain viable, right? Therefore, DBA has to decide on these factors before we come up with a proper database recovery plan. But in some cases, the organizations are not able to give the most costly solutions due to their budgets. Therefore, you have to always think of cost as well in maintaining the number of backups. Now, I think you can understand if you need more backups, then we need more storage devices, right? The other thing is, if you do not properly maintain backup, you can recover only partial data, right? Let's say you take only backups, only monthly backups. If you lost, then you can lost minimum of 1 month of data in your database if a failure occurs, right? If you take weekly backups, then your system can recover up to 1 week, right? 1 week from the failure, right? If you take daily backups, then you can recover up to 1 day, right? But keeping backups all the time is not practical, right? Therefore, we have to maintain a proper schedule to make backups. Otherwise, you will definitely run out of space. Right. These are the general guidelines, so you can quickly go through the points I have given in this slide. I have summarized the things here, so you can go through, quickly go through the points, so then you can understand that. This is related to what we discussed. In general, in theory, you have to make at least 2 local copies of each image copy backup. That is to avoid an unrecoverable state. As I told you, if you take backups in a very long duration, then you can recover up to that particular point. If it is a monthly backup, then your unrecoverable state is 1 month actually. You cannot recover you may not be able to recover data within 1 month because you have not backed up those data, right? Therefore, it is very important to maintain at least 2 local copies of each image copy backup to minimize the unrecoverable state. Right. And the other thing, you have to coordinate your local backup strategy with disaster recovery plan. That is very important. As I repeatedly told you, this backupping of data is mainly depending on the disaster recovery plan. As well as to continue the business, we have to have backups which we can restore or recover the system and keep the business up and running. Therefore, you need to keep at least 2 generations of image copy backup for each database object. And you can consider creating image copy backups to disks and migrating them into tapes, right? For an example, if your particular financial year ends, you can take a copy of backup into a CD or DVD or any possible optical disc. Right? It's a typical example. You can migrate that backup into a very cheap technology, and you can speed up the image copy process. Another thing is, you have to always include the system catalog database objects in your backup and recovery plan. Right? Otherwise, you would not be able to properly recover if the system catalog is not available. And the other thing is, you have to ensure that backup process is restartable. Therefore, at any given time, you should be able to restart the backup process, right? Then after the backup has been completed, the Dbms should be used, the available facilities to verify the correctness of the backup. Right? If you can remember, when you burn files into a DVD or any other optical disk, there is an option to check whether you have written all the things which you wanted, right? There's a process to verify. You can skip that to save the time, but still there's the option. Most of the DVD burning software, that is to verify the completeness of the backup. And the other thing is, the data is not stored in the database, but it can be used by the database application. Therefore, it has to be also backed up at the same time as the database objects. So these are general image copy guidelines. Or when you work as a DBA, you can follow these guidelines. For your intended job role. Right. Now we discuss on full versus incremental backups. As I told you in my exercise, I asked you different ways of making backups. So you can create full image copy backup as a complete copy of the data, but you can go for incremental backups. You have the major version and you append the minor content to the major version incrementally, right? That is called incremental backups. So you can do this incremental backups very frequently, and you need to get only the data that has changed since the last full or incremental image copy was made, right? Let's say you have made the backup by Saturday night, then you can make incremental backups daily, and you can append it to the major version. Then at any point in time, you can recover data up to a single day. Then you can minimize the unrecoverable state of the database. Here the main advantage is taking incremental rather than full backup is that sometimes it can be made more quickly and requires less space on disk, right? Because only few things has to be backed up, right? But there is a disadvantage. The recoveries based on incremental copies can take a bit longer because the same row is updated several times before the last change are restored. In a database, you can do many transactions. So when you, let's say you withdraw money several times, right? For the same day, or you deposit some amount, then you decide to withdraw some amount, and you likewise you may do different transactions, and the same records can be updated several times, right? Then it would take much time to recover a database. Right. This is a typical example depicted in this figure. What I discussed is summarized in this figure. You can carefully look at, we take the full backup on Sunday, then we take incremental backups for the rest of the days of the week, and we can merge that data into the full backup. Then it is going to be the full image backup for the next week, right? Then next Sunday we take again we have the full backup by Sunday. Then again we append the minor changes to the major version, right? Now we look at the incremental versus full image copy backup. If you check full image copies for small database objects, normally we define small and will vary from site to site and depend on different Dbms to Dbms. Therefore, we have to consider using incremental image copies to reduce the batch processing window for very large database objects, because when you deal with industrial databases, they are having very much capacity, right? If it is a banking system, for an example, you have millions of records even for 1 month, right? Therefore, it is very difficult to keep these backup, even they are the time duration is very short. But in some scenarios, the compatible with incremental image copy backups, some DBMSs permit the user to disable logging during some operations and utilities. But due to that, whenever an action is taken, it changes data without logging. That logging is recording to file. Therefore, you need full image copy to recover in this type of scenarios, right? Anyway, the database administrator has to base on full versus incremental decision on the percentage of block of data that have been modified, but not on the number of rows that have been modified, right? Therefore, the DBA has to decide what type of backups has to be taken. So you have to imagine how difficult task is this database backing up, right? That is why I gave you an example to feel how it is different from your day-to-day life. Then as we discussed, the merging incremental copies has to be periodically done to make the changes represented in the backups. Otherwise, we are not able to recover our full data set through the backups, right? Therefore, we can have some utilities like merge copy, depending on the different databases. You may given different utilities. So you can using this merge copy to combine multiple incremental image copy backups into a single incremental copy backup. So you merge all the things together and come up with a single image copy file, single backup, right? Then you have to do this for all the incremental backups. If you again go to this slide, then Sunday you take the full backup, and by Monday you do the merging to the full version. Then again you have the full version. Then Tuesday you again merge whatever you have done on Monday. Then you have again the full backup until Tuesday. Then you again do the merging to the work you have done on Tuesday. Likewise, you keep on doing that. Anyhow, the DBA has to come up with the proper plan. It is his duty, and then he can always ready to recover from a disaster. Therefore, it is very important to merging these incremental backups in order to create full backups. Now, if you take the databases can typically create image copy backups, but you have to keep in mind the levels supported will be depend on the Dbms being used, right? Depending on the different Dbms's, the different facilities are given to the database administrator. However, in general, to back up the database object has to be done for any database using any of the given utilities. Right. Once you have backup database objects, the other important thing is copying indexes. Right, I discussed about this indexing in one of my previous lessons. why indexing is important. Can you remember what is the importance of having indexes? Why we create indexes? Can't you remember why we need indexes? If you take typical thing, why I can remember I discussed why you use indexes in your textbooks. If you grab the idea, then it is easy for you to understand the content related to databases. The creating indexes is a matter of performance, right? To faster access to the database is maintained by creating these indexes. Now, if you just imagine if you write a select all query from a database having 8 or 100 million of records, your query would not be able to get the all data from the database and display you within a minimum time, right? It would take sometimes hours to retrieve the data from the database, right? If your database is very much large. So in banks, you have that much of records in a database. So if even to validate your PIN number as you insert the ATM card, it needs a lot of time if you have not properly done indexing, right? Therefore, in some databases, it allows you to support you to make backup copies of indexes as well. Okay? It depends on the DBMS. For example, it may give you facilities or utilities to backup indexes, but your cost would be much higher than the regular DBMS. Therefore, still you may decide to continue with the all Dbas or regular DBMS because of the license fee. The other thing is Dbms control. This examines the degree of control the DBMS assert over the backup and recovery process. And it also differs from DBMS to DBMS. In some DBMSs, the record backup and recovery information has to be done using the system catalog, and that information can be used to recover the data and determine the logs and backup logs and database backups required for successful recovery. Therefore, if you have more information, it helps you to successfully recover DBMS during the recovery process, right? More the information, more the DBMS can control proper usage during recovery. And if your DBMS does not record backups and recovery, then the system catalog, then DBA must track image copy backup files and assure the proper usage during the recovery. Have you done any transactions in your early semesters regarding database transactions? Okay, if you have done transaction, then you know what concurrent access is. Anyhow, in the concurrent access, you can do multiple reads and writes at the same time. That is what we call concurrent access, right? Meanwhile, you write to the file, someone else is also writes. Therefore, concurrent write access allows you to keep the data online during the backup process, but there's a problem. It will slow down any subsequent recovery because the Dbms has to examine the database log to ensure the accurate recovery. So anyhow, if you allow concurrent write accessors to keep the database online during the backup process, then you have to understand it will slow down the recovery process. The other thing is it can create an up-to-date image copy backup by merging existing image copies with data from the database logs. As I told you, you can utilize database logs as an entry point to recover the database. So even if there is a power failure and your transaction not completed, then it is written in the log file, and these logs can be read by the system admin and make the relevant changes, right? Make the recoveries. Anyway, there are some image copy backup techniques where you can have only the read access to the database objects. Because if you do only the reads, then there's no change in the database, right? Anybody can read concurrently, but it does not change any database state, right? But if one is writing and one is reading, or both are trying to write, then there would be definitely a problem in how to save those data in the database file, right? Let's say one is withdrawing money. Before he withdraw the money, he would check the account balance. He would have, let's assume he is having 10,000 in his account. At the same time, another person is also looking at the account, and he is also seeing 10,000. Let's say it's a joint account, then both two persons are seeing the same amount, 10,000. So each of clients may be trying to withdraw money, right? Then first one also withdraw money from the 10,000, and second one is also going to withdraw the money from 10,000, right? So let's say one is trying to withdraw 8,000 and another one is 5,000. Then you just imagine the scenario. It has actually exceeded the amount in the account, right? 8,000 and 5,000. But both the people take that decision because they see the incorrect data actually. Both are seeing the 10,000, but when you do the transaction, that value is not the actual value stored in the database, right? If first person is getting 8,000, then the remaining is 2,000, right? It is not visible to the second person because they are doing the transactions at the same time. Therefore, we have to avoid such situation. Since you have not done transaction, you may not be having the idea. Anyhow, that is a kind of concurrent access. You have to understand the issues related to concurrent accesses. Anyway, when you want to make backup, you have to consider these things when you want to come up with a backup plan. You need to concurrent access and modifications during the backup process, and the amount of time available for backup process, and the impact of concurrent accesses on the speed of backing up data. The other point is the speed of recovery utilities. We discussed about the factors affecting the time duration for recovery in today's slides. You can recall that as well. And other thing is need for access to the database logs. Or finally, the difference between hot backup and cool backup. So you have to consider these things in planning the backups in database recovery. Now, if you take this hot versus cool backup, normally we call cool backup. We take the backup by shutting down the database instance and backing up the relevant database files. Whereas the hot backup is performed while the database instance is remaining online, right? We do not shut down the database. That is why we call it hot. It is not shut down, it's live, up and running. This ensures that concurrent access is possible, right? Because database is online. Anyway, depending on the capabilities of the Dbms which you are using, the hot backups can introduce some problems due to several reasons. The one reason would be it is much complex to be implemented. The other one is it can cause additional overhead in the form of higher CPU as well as input-output to archive log files, right? Because as we discussed in backups, we need to have log files. To read and write log files, it needs more time. And the other thing, database administrator may need to create site-specific script to perform the hot backups, right? You may not be able to have only the general way of creating the backup. Instead, you have to have specific backup scripts for specific purposes. Other thing is they require extensive testing to ensure that backups are viable for recovery, right? Because if even a part of original database is missed, then you are not be able to recover that part. Right? That is the risk. Therefore, DBA has to thoroughly test to ensure that the backups are viable for recovery. Then DBA has to look into the backup consistency, because your backup should create consistent recovery point for the database objects. For example, you may need to be aware of all the relationships between the database objects being backup and another database objects, including like application enforced relationships, referential constraints, triggers, right? There can be sometimes assertions. Likewise, you have to aware of all the relationships between the database objects which are being backed up. And the other thing is, if you use an image copy to recover database object to a previous point in time, then at that point you need to recover any related database objects to the same point in time. So if you fail to do so, it will most likely result in inconsistent data, right? Therefore, if your database is not consistent, then it would introduce many problems when you recover that database. Right. The important thing is, as we discussed, we need to create points of consistency, but we have to understand when to create a point of consistency. Then the DBA should create these points of consistency during the daily processing, right? We discussed about incremental backups. So in that case also we can create the consistency points before archiving the active logs, right? That is one way. Or else we can create before copying related database objects. Or else just after creating an image copy backup, right? The other way is just before heavy database modifications, right? Or during quiet times. Anyway, it is very important for DBA to create these points of consistency, so we can assure up to that point our database is consistent, right? Otherwise, after recovering the database, we do not know actually if the database is totally recovered. Are there any missing things, right? After the crash, what are the things missed? So it is very difficult to be understood and identified by the DBA if it is not properly prepare the points of consistency. Then, as we have already discussed these log files, which we can use to recover databases. In all the databases, normally we log into a file commonly called transaction log or database logs. When you do SQL statements like insert, update, delete, or whatever, then once the statement is successfully committed, your log file get populated whether the SQL statements are properly executed or not. Therefore, the database log data to which records are currently being written is referred as active log, right? If you say a particular log is active, that log file is the current one which is being used, right? As the number of database changes or grows, the database log will increase in size. That is why we discussed to maintain logs, we need more space, right? We create more logs, then we need more capacity in the database. Therefore, Dbas has to typically control the frequency of creating log archival process, right? If you frequently make log archives, then you would run out of space. Therefore, Dba has to understand what type of things has to be logged, and most Dbms provides commands to allow Dbas to manually request log archives. If it is fully automatic way, then you can't omit that part. But to save the disk space, there's an option given to the Dba to manually request the log archival process. Anyway, each Dbms performs log archival and backups in different manner. Therefore, as a Dba oracle may not be, the commands and utilities may not be same for the Dba of Microsoft SQL. But the concepts are the same, but commands and utilities are different. Anyhow, you have to determine your backup schedule as a Dba. In that case, not all data is created equal, right? It's obvious not all data is not in equal importance. So you have to understand how much daily activity occurs against the data and how often does the data change and how critical is the data to the business, right? If that data is not that much critical to the business, so you may not want to create you may not be want to consider that in your backup schedules. And the other thing, can the data be recreated easily, right? For an example, if you have the NIC number, we know you can get the birth date and your age and everything can be created or calculated. So if possible, you may want only the NIC, right? You can recreate that thing. Therefore, you have to consider that if it is easily recreatable, then you may not want to consider that for backup schedule. Then what kind of access do the users need, right? You have to check whether the users requesting 24/7 access is required. Like in banks, then it is very critical. If it is not required, then you have plenty of time to do the backups, right? If the database is much critical and higher demanding, then finding the time to make backups is a difficult task, right? Because it takes some time. And during that time, the database may not be available. It depends on the way we have configured. But anyway, you have to consider that. And the other thing, what is the cost of not having the data available during the recovery? Let's say, what is the dollar value associated with each minute of downtime? It's a typical example. Right? Therefore, you can determine your backup schedule based on these factors. Right. We'll quickly look at Dbms instance backups. In addition to being prepared for a failure of individual database object, database administrator must be prepared for recover from the failure of a database instance or subsystem, right? Therefore, DBA has to make sure to back up all the crucial components of the database instance, including DBMS files, system catalog and directory objects, database logs, configuration and setup files, system libraries, and tape management libraries, as well as the program source libraries and executable libraries. Right? Therefore, because the DBA has to always be ready for a failure. That is the important thing. So therefore, DBMS has to ready for the instance backup before actually the failure occurs. Then there are alternate approaches for database backup. that is using database exports to create logical backups of the database, and the other one is using storage management software to make backup copies. Those two alternatives can be utilized to make backups. Those are alternative approach to database backups. However, when backing up outside the scope of Dbms control, we have to be sure to disable database write operations to for all the database objects that are being backed up, right? Because if you are using the Dbms utilities to create the backup, then Dbms know how to control that. But if you are using any other backup utilities outside the Dbms, then you have to be very careful to disable write operations, right? Otherwise, it would lead to inconsistent data, which we discussed in concurrency access. Right. The other thing is you have to be sure as the DBA, he has to understand both the functionality of the storage management software as well as the database management. If you take one example, in some storage management software will not copy open files, right? If the file is open, then the storage management software would not back up that file, right? Then if you are trying to recover by restoring that backup, then that file is not available in the backup. That is a critical situation if you have not properly considered and understood. As a good practice, DBAs should document the backup strategy, right? Otherwise, if that particular DBA resigns from the organization, another one would also not know what is the way of making backups out of the database, right? So in that case, DBA has to thoroughly document and test the backup and recovery strategy, implementation and procedures. He has to test recovery from media failures, instance failures, and several types of application failures. To test that, the DBA can manually create backup servers, and he can purposely fail or shut down the main server and try to connect to the backup server, right? So if it is successful, if the backup server is able to handle the workload and other relevant accesses to the database without any problem, then you know if the same thing happened at a failure, you are still in the safe side. Therefore, DBAs should properly document their strategy of making the backups. Also, the DBA, the group of DBAs should schedule periodic evaluations of the backup and recovery plans for every production database. That is why I told you the DBS has to be purposely shut down the servers and check whether it is working as expected to be worked at a disastrous situation.